again, and I'm reading in someone's room. Sorry about that. I was hoping that we were going to be able to use the usual setup that I have, similar to the one I have at home. Well, the one that you're used to at home. But I can't get my laptop to work for it. Sorry about that. So anyway, here we go. We are reading The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald. Now, I'm not sure what part we're up to because when I'm doing it on my phone, it doesn't remember all the nice little bits of information I give you. So here we go anyway. It is The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald, and we're starting at chapter 20, which is counterplotting. The previous chapter, just in case you're wondering, was chapter 19, which was the King's Chamber. It's when they found themselves, eventually, in the King's room, and the King didn't appear to be well, but they also found the Princess, didn't they? This is they being Curdie and Lena, his odd creature companion, who has actually so far proved to be quite helpful. So here we go, counterplotting. Curdie was already sufficiently enlightened as to how things were going to see that he must have the princess on one mind with him. That's because they're finding out that things haven't been so well with the king. He's unwell, but it looks like maybe there have been people doing things they shouldn't do, which are affecting him. Oh, that's my little iPad actually giving you the weird lighting on my glasses. Not the window. I thought it was the window. Let's go for more lighting from the window instead and see if that helps us. There you go. So yes, now I'm going to look all washed out, but that's okay. Anyway, Curdie was already sufficiently enlightened as to how things were going to see that he must have the princess of one mind with him, and they must work together. It was clear that amongst those about the king there was a plot against him. For one thing, they had agreed in a lie concerning himself, and it was plain also that the doctor was working out a design against the health and reason of his majesty, rendering the question of his life a matter of little moment. It was in itself sufficient to justify the worst fears, that the people outside the palace were ignorant of His Majesty's condition. He believed those inside it also, the butler excepted, were ignorant of it as well. Doubtless His Majesty's councillors desired to alienate the hearts of his subjects from their sovereign. Curdie's idea was that they intended to kill the king, marry the princess to one of themselves, and found a new dynasty. But whatever their purpose, there was treason in the palace of the worst sort. They were making and keeping the king incapable in order to effect that purpose. The first thing to be seen to, therefore, was that His Majesty should neither eat morsel nor drink drop of anything prepared for him in the palace. Could this have been managed without the princess, Curdie would have preferred leaving her in ignorance of the horrors from which he sought to deliver her. He feared also the danger of her knowledge betraying itself to the evil eyes about her, but it must be risked, and she had always been a wise child. Another thing was clear to him, that with such traitors no terms of honour were either binding or possible, and that short of lying he might use any means to foil them, and he could not doubt that the old princess had sent him expressly to frustrate their plans. That's good to know. While he stood thinking thus with himself, the princess was earnestly watching the king with looks of childish love and womanly tenderness that went to Curdie's heart. Now and then, with a great fan of peacock feathers, she would fan him very softly. Now and then, seeing a cloud begin to gather upon the sky of his face, she would climb upon the bed and, bending to his ear, whisper into it, then draw back and watch again, generally to see the cloud disperse. In his deepest slumber, the soul of the king lay open to the voice of his child, and that voice had power either to change the aspect of his visions, or, which was better still, to breathe hope into his heart and courage to endure them. Curdie came nearer and softly called her. "I can't leave Papa just yet," she returned in a low voice. "I will wait," said Curdie, "but I want very much to say something." In a few moments she came. Thank you for joining. In a few moments, she came to him where he stood under the lamp. "Well, Curdie, what is it?" she said. "Princess," he replied, "I want to tell you that I have found why your grandmother sent me." "Come this way then," she answered, "where I can see the face of my king." Curdie placed a chair for her in the spot she chose, where she would be near enough to mark any slightest change on her father's countenance, yet where their low-voiced talk would not disturb him. There he sat down beside her and told her all the story, how her grandmother had sent her good pigeon for him, how she had instructed him and sent him there without telling him what he had to do. Then he told her what he had discovered of the state of things generally in Gwynchestorm, and especially what he had heard and seen in the palace that night. "Things are in a bad state enough," he said in conclusion. "Lying and selfishness and inhospitality and dishonesty everywhere, and to crown all they speak with disrespect of the good king, and not a man of them knows he is ill." "You frighten me dreadfully," said Irene, trembling. "You must be brave for your king's sake," said Curdie. "Indeed I will," she replied, and returned a long, loving look upon the beautiful face of her father. "But what is to be done? And how am I to believe such horrible things of Dr Kelman?" "My dear princess," replied Curdie, "you know nothing of him but his face and his tongue, and they are both false. Either you must be aware of him, or you must doubt your grandmother and me, for I tell you by the gift she gave me of testing hands that this man is a snake. That round body he shows is but the cast of a serpent. Perhaps the creature lies there at its nest, coiled round and round inside." "Horrible," said Irene. "Horrible indeed, but we must not try to get rid of horrible things by refusing to look at them and saying they are not there. Is not your beautiful father sleeping better since he had the wine?" "Yes." "Does he always sleep better after having it?" She reflected an instant. "No." "Always worse till tonight," she answered. "Then remember that was the wine I got him, not what the butler drew. Nothing that passes through any hand in the house except yours or mine must henceforth, till he is well, reach his Majesty's lips." "But how, dear Curdie?" said the princess, almost crying. "That we must contrive," answered Curdie. "I know how to take care of the wine, but for his food, now we must think." "He hardly takes any," said the princess with a pathetic shake of her little head, which Curdie had almost learned to look for. "The more need," he replied. "There should be no poison in it." Irene shuddered. "As soon as he has honest food, he will begin to grow better, and you must be just as careful for yourself, princess," he said, "for you don't know when they may begin to poison you too." "There is no fear of me. Don't talk about me," said Irene. "The good food, how are we to get it, Curdie? That's the whole question." "I'm thinking hard," answered Curdie. "The good food, let me see. Such servants as I saw below are sure to have the best of everything for themselves. I will go and see what I can find on their supper table. The Chancellor sleeps in the house, and he is master of the king's horse. He and the master of the king's horse always have their supper together in a room off the great hall to the right as you go down the stairs," said Irene. "I would go with you, but I dare not leave my father. Alas, he scarcely ever takes more than a mouthful. I can't think how he lives. And the very thing he would like and often asks for, a bit of bread, I can hardly ever get for him. Dr Kelman has forbidden it and says it is nothing less than poison to him." "Bread at least he shall have," said Curdie, "and that with the honest wine will do as well as anything, I do believe. I will go at once and look for some. But I want you to see Lena first and know her, lest coming upon her by accident at any time you should be frightened." "I should like much to see her," said the princess. Warning her not to be startled by the ugliness, he went to the door and called Lena. She entered, creeping with downcast head and dragging her tail over the floor behind her. Curdie watched the princess as the frightful creature came nearer and nearer. One shudder went from head to foot of her, and the next instant she stepped to meet her. Lena dropped flat on the floor and covered her face with her two big paws. It went to the heart of the princess. In a moment she was on her knees beside her, stroking the ugly head and patting her all over. "Good dog, dear ugly dog," she said. Lena whimpered. "I believe," said Curdie, "from what your grandmother told me, that Lena is a woman and that she was naughty but is now growing good." Lena had lifted her head while Irene was caressing her. Now she dropped it again between her paws, but the princess took it in her hands and kissed the forehead betwixt the gold-green eyes. "Shall I take her with me or leave her?" asked Curdie. "Leave her, poor dear," said Irene, and Curdie, knowing the way now, went without her. He took his way first to the room of the princess had spoken of, and there also were the remains of supper, but neither there nor in the kitchen could he find a scrap of plain, wholesome-looking bread. So he returned and told her that as soon as it was light, he would go into the city for some, and asked her for a handkerchief to tie it in. If he could not bring it himself, he would send it by Lena, who would keep out of sight better than he, and as soon as all was quiet as night, he would come to her again. He also asked her to tell the king that he was in the house. His hope lay in the fact that bakers everywhere go to work early, but it was yet much too early, so he persuaded the princess to lie down, promising to call her if the king should stir. So he took a turn looking after the king. So that's the end of that chapter, and I'm going to have a drink of water and a sip of coffee, because remember, we drink our water in the chapter breaks. Well, I drink my water in the chapter breaks. So how are you, and what have you been up to? Nikki, have you been creating art? I hope so. Doing more of your books. They're wonderful. I'm down in Wellington at the moment, and we've had some horrible, horrible weather. It's been pouring with rain, and it's been howling a gale, and there's been floods on some of the roads. Thankfully, the place we're staying is up a hill, quite a big hill. So we haven't been affected by the floods, but there have been roads that have been closed because of the floods. Some of the roads have looked like rivers with waterfalls and fountains in the middle of them. It's rather odd. Yeah, it's not their normal weather. No, Wellington doesn't normally have weather as bad as that. Not most of the time. But the sun is shining today. Well, it is at the moment. I'm looking out the window. Yes, it's shining at the moment. See? It's lovely. I would sit here like this to read to you, but then I couldn't see the words at all, nor could I see the screen. Anyway, so even though the sun's shining, though, it's still quite cold because it is winter time here in New Zealand. So I'm enjoying a nice hot cup of coffee that I made just before we started. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're not too hot if you're in summer over in the Northern Hemisphere. And if you're in New Zealand or anywhere else in the Southern Hemisphere, I hope that you're not too cold, too wet, too blown away by the wind, and that you've got somewhere nice and safe to sit and relax. So we shall carry on with The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald. It's a Victorian fantasy story, and we are reading chapter 21, and it's called The Loaf. His Majesty slept very quietly. The dawn had grown almost day, and still Curdie lingered, unwilling to disturb the princess. At last, however, he called her, and she was in the room in a moment. She had slept, she said, and felt quite fresh. Delighted to find her father still asleep, and so peacefully, she pushed her chair close to the bed and sat down with her hands in her lap. Curdie got his mattock from where he had hidden it behind a great mirror, and went to the cellar, followed by Lena. They took some breakfast with them as they passed through the hall, and as soon as they had eaten it, went out the back way. At the mouth of the passage, Curdie seized the rope, drew himself up, pushed away the shutter, and entered the dungeon. Then he swung the end of the rope to Lena, and she caught it in her teeth. When her master said, "Now, Lena," she gave a great spring, and he ran away with the end of the rope as fast as ever he could, and such a spring had she made that by the time he had to bear her weight, she was within a few feet of the hole. The instant she got a paw through, she was all through. So she's quite strong and agile. Apparently their enemies were waiting till hunger should have cowed them, for there was no sign of any attempt having been made to open the door. A blow or two of Curdie's mattock drove the shattered lock clean from it, and telling Lena to wait there till he came back and let no one in, he walked out into the silent street and drew the door to behind him. He could hardly believe it was not yet a whole day since he had been thrown in there with his hands tied at his back. Down the street he went, walking in the middle of the street, that if anyone saw him he might see he was not afraid and hesitate to rouse an attack on him. As to the dogs, ever since the death of two of their companions, a shadow that looked like a mattock was enough to make them scamper. As soon as he reached the archway of the city gate, he turned to reconnoitre the baker's shop, and perceiving no sign of movement, waited there, watching for the first. After about an hour, the door opened, and the baker's man appeared with a pail in his hand. He went to a pump that stood in the street, and having filled his pail, returned with it into the shop. Curdie stole after him, found the door on the latch, opened it very gently, peeped in, saw nobody, and entered. Remembering perfectly from what shelf the baker's wife had taken the loaf she said was the best, and seeing just one upon it, he seized it, laid the price of it on the counter, and sped softly out and up the street. Once more in the dungeon beside Lena, his first thought was to fasten up the door again, which would have been easy, so many iron fragments of all sorts and sizes lay about, but he bethought himself that if he left it as it was and they came to find him, they would conclude at once that they had made their escape by it, and would look no further so as to discover the hole. He therefore merely pushed the door close and left it. Then once more carefully arranging the earth behind the shutter so that it should again fall with it, he returned to the cellar. And now he had to convey the loaf to the princess. If he could venture to take it himself, well; if not, he would send Lena. He crept to the door of the servants' hall and found the sleepers beginning to stir. One said it was time to go to bed, another that he would go to the cellar instead and have a mug of wine to waken himself up, while the third challenged the fourth to give him his revenge at some game or other. "Oh, hang your losses," answered his companion. "You'll soon pick up twice as much about the house if you but keep your eyes open." Perceiving there would be a risk in attempting to pass through, and reflecting that the porters in the great hall would probably be awake also, Curdie went back to the cellar, took Irene's handkerchief with the loaf in it, tied it round Lena's neck, and told her to take it to the princess. Using every shadow and every shelter, Lena slid through the servants like a shapeless terror through a guilty mind, and so by corridor and great hall, up the stair to the king's chamber. Irene trembled a little when she saw her glide soundless in across the silent dusk of the morning that filtered through the heavy drapery of the windows, but she recovered herself at once when she saw the bundle about her neck, for it both assured her of Curdie's safety and gave her hope of her father's. She untied it with joy, and Lena stole away silent as she had come. Her joy was the greater that the king had woke up a little while before and expressed a desire for food. Not that he felt exactly hungry, he said, and yet he wanted something, if only he might have a piece of nice, fresh bread. Irene had no knife, but with eager hands she broke a great piece from the loaf and poured out a full glass of wine. The king ate and drank, enjoyed the bread and the wine much, and instantly fell asleep again. It was hours before the lazy people brought their breakfast. When it came, Irene crumbled a little about, threw some into the fireplace, and managed to make the tray look just as usual. In the meantime, down below in the cellar, Curdie was lying in the hollow between the upper sides of two of the great casks, the warmest place he could find. Lena was watching. She lay at his feet across the two casks and did her best so to arrange her huge tail that it would be a warm cover for her master. By and by Dr Kelman called to see his patient, and now that Irene's eyes were opened, she saw clearly enough that he was both annoyed and puzzled at finding his Majesty rather better. He pretended, however, to congratulate him. saying he believed he was quite fit to see the Lord Chamberlain. He wanted his signature to something important, only he must not strain his mind to understand it, whatever it might be. If His Majesty did, he would not be answerable for the consequences. The king said he would see the Lord Chamberlain, and the doctor went. Then Irene gave him more bread and wine, and the king ate and drank and smiled a feeble smile, the first real one she had seen for many a day. He said he felt much better and would soon be able to take matters into his own hands again. He had a strange, miserable feeling, he said, that things were going terribly wrong, although he could not tell how. Then the princess told him that Curdie was come, and that at night, when all was quiet, for nobody in the palace must know, he would pay His Majesty a visit. Her great-great-grandmother had sent him, she said. The king looked strangely upon her, but the strange look passed into a smile, clearer than the first, and Irene's heart throbbed with delight. And that's the end of that chapter. So it's time for another drink of water. Do you have paper and pencils so you can sketch, do little drawings that come to your mind from what you're hearing of the words in the story? It's always a good idea to keep your hands busy, as a way to keep your hands busy when you're reading a story, or hearing a story, I should say. Sometimes you can enjoy listening to a story, but your body wants to do something. So if you give it something to do, like drawing a picture, or playing finger games, or doing crafts like knitting or crochet or anything like that, then by doing that, you actually give your mind the room to listen while your body has something to keep it busy so it doesn't get too restless. So I'm going to carry on. I'm just moving my chair slightly because the sun is coming around and I don't want to get blinded by it. So here we go. I'll just turn this around so I can still see you and you can see me. That's a wardrobe behind me. And I'm not sure if you can see anything over that side because it's covered by my chat box. We'll carry on. The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald, Chapter 22. The Lord Chamberlain. At noon, the Lord Chamberlain appeared. Sorry, just moving something slightly. With a long, low bow and paper in hand, he stepped softly into the room. Greeting His Majesty with every appearance of the profoundest respect and congratulating him on the evident progress he had made, he declared himself sorry to trouble him, but there were certain papers, he said, which required his signature, and therewith drew nearer to the king, who lay looking at him doubtfully. He was a lean, long, yellow man with a small head, bald over the top, and tufted at the back and about his ears. He had a very thin, prominent, hooked nose and a quantity of loose skin under his chin and about his throat, which came craning up out of his neckcloth. His eyes were very small, sharp, and glittering, and he looked as black as jet. He had hardly enough of a mouth to make a smile with. His left hand held the paper, and the long, skinny fingers of his right, a pen just dipped in ink. But the king, who for weeks had hardly known what he did, was today so much himself as to be aware that he was not quite himself, and the moment he saw the paper he resolved that he would not sign without understanding and approving of it. He requested the Lord Chamberlain, therefore, to read it. His lordship commenced at once, but the difficulties he seemed to encounter, and the fits of stammering that seized him, roused the king's suspicion tenfold. He called the princess. "I trouble his lordship too much," he said to her. "You can read print well, my child. Let me hear how you can read writing. Take that paper from his lordship's hand and read it to me from beginning to end, while my lord drinks a glass of my favourite wine and watches for your blunders." "Pardon me, your majesty," said the Lord Chamberlain, with as much of a smile as he was able to extemporize, "but it were 1,000 pities to put the attainments of Her Royal Highness to a test altogether too severe." Your Majesty can scarcely with justice expect the very organs of her speech to prove capable of compassing words so long and to her so unintelligible. I think much of my little princess and her capabilities, returned the king, more and more aroused. Pray, my lord, permit her to try. Consider, your Majesty, the thing would be altogether without precedent. It would be to make sport of statecraft, said the Lord Chamberlain. Perhaps you are right, my lord, answered the king, with more meaning than he intended should be manifest, while to his growing joy he felt new life and power throbbing in his heart and brain. So this morning we shall read no farther. I am indeed ill able for business of such weight. Will your Majesty please sign your royal name here, said the Lord Chamberlain, preferring the request as a matter of course, and approaching with the feather end of the pen pointed to a spot where there was a great red seal. Not today, my lord, replied the king. It is of the greatest importance, your Majesty, softly insisted the other. I descried no such importance in it, said the king. Your Majesty heard but a part, and I can hear no more today. I trust your Majesty has ground enough in a case of necessity like the present to sign upon the representation of his loyal subject and Chamberlain, or shall I call the Lord Chancellor, he added, rising. There is no need. I have the very highest opinion of your judgment, my lord, answered the king. That is, with respect to means, we might differ as to ends. The Lord Chamberlain made yet further attempts at persuasion, but they grew feebler and feebler. He was at last compelled to retire without having gained his object. And well might his annoyance be keen, for that paper was the king's will, drawn up by the Attorney-General. Not until they had the king's signature to it was there much use in venturing further. But his worst sense of discomfiture arose from finding the king with so much capacity left, for the doctor had pledged himself to so weaken his brain that he should be as a child in their hands, incapable of refusing anything requested of him. His lordship began to doubt the doctor's fidelity to the conspiracy. The princess was in high delight. She had not for weeks heard so many words, nor not to say words of such strength and reason, from her father's lips. Day by day he had been growing weaker and more lethargic. He was so much exhausted, however, after his effort, that he asked for another piece of bread and more wine, and fell fast asleep the moment he had taken them. The Lord Chamberlain sent in a rage for Dr Kelman. He came, and while professing himself unable to understand the symptoms described by his lordship, yet pledged himself again that on the morrow the king should do whatever was required of him. The day went on. When his Majesty was awake, the princess read to him, one storybook after another, and whatever she read the king listened as if he had never heard anything so good before, making out in it the wisest meanings. Every now and then he asked for a piece of bread and a little wine, and every time he ate and drank, he slept, and every time he woke, he seemed better than the last time. The princess bearing her part, the loaf was eaten up and the flagon emptied before night. The butler took the flagon away and brought it back filled to the brim, but both were thirsty as well as hungry when Curdie came again. Meantime he and Lena, watching and waking alternately, had plenty of sleep. In the afternoon, peeping from the recess, they saw several of the servants enter hurriedly one after the other, draw wine and drink it, and steal out, but their business was to take care of the king, not his cellar, and they let them drink. So Curdie's business was to take care of the king, not his cellar. So they let the servants drink. Also, when the butler came to fill the flagon, they restrained themselves, for the villain's fate was not yet ready for him. He looked terribly frightened, and had brought with him a large candle and a small terrier, which is a type of dog, which latter indeed threatened to be troublesome, for he went roving and sniffing about until he came to the recess where they were. But as soon as he showed himself, Lena opened her jaws so wide and glared at him so horribly that without even uttering a whimper, he tucked his tail between his legs and ran to his master. He was drawing the wicked wine at the moment and did not see him, else he would doubtless have run too. When supper time approached, Curdie took his place at the door into the servants' hall, but after a long hour's vain watch, he began to fear he should get nothing. There was so much idling about, as well as coming and going. It was hard to bear, chiefly from the attractions of a splendid loaf just fresh out of the oven, which he longed to secure for the king and princess. At length his chance did arrive. He pounced upon the loaf, I'm just putting something down, and carried it away, and soon after got hold of a pie. This time, however, both loaf and pie were missed. The cook was called. He declared he had provided both. One of themselves, he said, must have carried them away for some friend outside the palace. Then a housemaid, who had not long been one of them, said she had seen someone like a page running in the direction of the cellar with something in his hands. Instantly all turned upon the pages, accusing them one after another. All denied, but nobody believed one of them. There was no truth. Where there is no truth, there can be no faith. To the cellar they all set out to look for the missing pie and loaf. Lena heard them coming, as well she might, for they were talking and quarrelling loud, and gave her master warning. They snatched up everything and got all signs of their presence out at the back door before the servants entered. When they found nothing, they all turned on the chambermaid and accused her not only of lying against the pages, but of having taken the things herself. Their language and behaviour so disgusted Curdie, who could hear a great part of what passed, and he saw the danger of discovery now so much increased, that he began to devise how best at once to rid the palace of the whole pack of them. That, however, would be small gain so long as the treacherous officers of state continued in it. They must be first dealt with. A thought came to him, and the longer he looked at it, the better he liked it. As soon as the servants were gone, quarrelling and accusing all the way, they returned and finished their supper. Then Curdie, who had long been satisfied that Lena understood almost every word he said, communicated his plan to her, and knew by the wagging of her tail and the flashing of her eyes that she comprehended it. Until they had the king safe, through the worst part of the night, however, nothing could be done. They had now merely to go on waiting where they were till the household should be asleep. This waiting and waiting was much the hardest thing Curdie had to do in the whole affair. He took his mattock and, going again into the long passage, lighted a candle end and proceeded to examine the rock on all sides. But this was not merely to pass the time. He had a reason for it. When he broke the stone in the street over which the baker fell, its appearance led him to pocket a fragment for further examination, and since then he had satisfied himself that it was the kind of stone in which gold is found, and that the yellow particles in it were pure metal. If such stone existed here in any plenty, he could soon make the king rich and independent of his ill-conditioned subjects. He was therefore now bent on an examination of the rock, nor had he been at it long before he was persuaded that there were large quantities of gold in the half-crystalline white stone, with its veins of opaque white and of green, of which the rock, so far as he had been able to inspect it, seemed almost entirely to consist. Don't forget that the whole town was built on a rock that sat in the river. Every piece he broke was spotted with particles and little lumps of a lovely greenish yellow, and that was gold. Hitherto he had worked only in silver, that's what he used to mine, but he had read and heard talk, and knew therefore about gold. As soon as he had got the king free of rogues and villains, he would have all the best and most honest miners, with his father at the head of them, to work this rock for the king. It was a great delight to him to use his mattock once more. The time went quickly, and when he left the passage to go to the king's chamber, he had already a good heap of fragments behind the broken door. And that's the end of that chapter. And I'm going to have a drink of coffee and of water. And I'm going to move again, just a little bit. I hope you're comfortable. Don't forget, you need to have your drink of water too. Okay? Have you taken your drink of water? Quickly, while I move my chair and my camera, you can run off and have a pee if you need it. This way you get to see a little bit more of this room too that I'm in. There we go. Nearly there. Oops. And bring you the camera slightly closer. I haven't started yet, don't panic. It's a lovely room. It's actually up on the top of a 2 or 3 story house, but it's a really old house in one of the inner suburbs of Wellington, a suburb called Mount Victoria, but it's not actually up the mount. That's a big hill behind us, which we can't see from where I'm sitting at the moment, but that's all right. Anyway, so, oh, coffee, forgot the coffee. There, that's better. And we shall carry on. Welcome back. So, The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald, a Victorian fantasy story. Chapter 23, Dr Kelman. As soon as he had reason to hope the way was clear, Curdie ventured softly into the hall with Lena behind him. There was no one asleep on the bench or floor, but by the fading fire sat a girl weeping. It was the same who had seen him carrying off the food and had been so hardly used for saying so. She opened her eyes when he appeared, but did not seem frightened at him. "I know why you weep," said Curdie, "and I am sorry for you." "It is hard not to be believed just because one speaks the truth," said the girl, "but that seems reason enough with some people. My mother taught me to speak the truth, and took such pains with me that I should find it hard to tell a lie, though I could invent many a story these servants would believe at once, for the truth is a strange thing here, and they don't know it when they see it. Show it to them, and they all stare as if it were a wicked lie, and that with the lie yet warm, that has just left their own mouths." "You are a stranger," she said, and burst out weeping afresh, "but the stranger you are to such a place and such people, the better." It sounds like she's not happy here. "I am the person," said Curdie, "whom you saw carrying the things from the supper table." He showed her the loaf. If you can trust as well as speak the truth, I will trust you." "Can you trust me?" She looked at him steadily for a moment. "I can," she answered. "One more thing," said Curdie. "Have you courage as well as faith?" "I think so." "Look my dog in the face and don't cry out. Come here, Lena." Lena obeyed. The girl looked at her and laid her hand on her head. "Now I know you are a true woman," said Curdie. "I am come to set things right in this house. Not one of the servants knows I am here. Will you tell them tomorrow morning that if they do not alter their ways and give over drinking and lying and stealing and unkindness, they shall every one of them be driven from the palace?" "They will not believe me," she said. Most likely, but will you give them the chance?" "I will." "Then I will be your friend. Wait here till I come again." She looked him once more in the face and sat down. When he reached the royal chamber, he found His Majesty awake and very anxiously expecting him. He received him with the utmost kindness, and at once, as it were, put himself in his hands by telling him all he knew concerning the state he was in. His voice was feeble, but his eye was clear, and although now and then his words and thoughts seemed to wander, Curdie could not be certain that the cause of their not being intelligible to him did not lie in himself. The king told him that for some years, ever since his queen's death, he had been losing heart over the wickedness of his people. He had tried hard to make them good, but they got worse and worse. Evil teachers, unknown to him, had crept into the schools. There was a general decay of truth and right principle, at least in the city, and as that set the example to the nation, it must spread. The main cause of his illness was the despondency by which the degeneration of his people affected him. He could not sleep and had terrible dreams, while to his unspeakable shame and distress he doubted almost everybody. He had striven against his suspicion, but in vain, and his heart was sore, for his courtiers and counsellors were really kind, only he could not think why none of their ladies came near his princess. The whole country was discontented, he heard, and there were signs of a gathering storm outside as well as inside his borders. The master of the horse gave him sad news of the insubordination of the army, and his great white horse was dead, they told him, and his sword had lost its temper. It bent double the last time he tried it. Only perhaps that was in a dream. And they could not find his shield, and one of his spurs had lost the rowel. Plus the poor king went wandering in a maze of, sorrows, some of which were purely imaginary, while others were truer than he understood. He told how thieves came at night and tried to take his crown, so that he never dared let it out of his hands, even when he slept, and how every night an evil demon in the shape of his physician came and poured poison down his throat. He knew it to be poison, he said, somehow, although it tasted like wine. Here he stopped, faint with the unusual exertion of talking. Curdie seized the flagon and ran to the wine cellar. In the servants' hall the girl still sat by the fire waiting for him. As he returned, he told her to follow him, and left her at the chamber door till he should rejoin her. When the king had had a little wine, he informed himself that he had already discovered certain of his majesty's enemies, and one of the worst of them was the doctor, for it was no other demon than the doctor himself who had been coming every night and giving him a slow poison. "So," said the king, "then I have not been suspicious enough, for I thought it was but a dream. Is it possible Kelman can be such a wretch? Who then am I to trust?" "Not one in the house except the princess and myself," said Curdie. "I will not go to sleep," said the king. "That would be as bad as taking the poison," said Curdie. "No, no, sire, you must show your confidence by leaving all the watching to me and doing all the sleeping your majesty can." I think Curdie wants him to regain his strength and health. The king smiled a contented smile, turned on his side, and was presently fast asleep. Then Curdie persuaded the princess also to go to sleep, and telling Lena to watch, went to the housemaid. He asked her if she could inform him which of the council slept in the palace, and show him their rooms. She knew every one of them, she said, and took him the round of all their doors, telling him which slept in each room. He then dismissed her, and returning to the king's chamber, seated himself behind a curtain at the head of the bed, on the side farthest from the king. He told Lena to get under the bed and make no noise. About 1 o'clock, the doctor came stealing in. He looked round for the princess, and seeing no one, smiled with satisfaction as he approached the wine, where it stood under the lamp. Having partly filled a glass, he took from his pocket a small phial, and that's phial. It's a little wee. We would call it a vial now, vial, and filled up the glass from it. The light fell upon his face from above, and Curdie saw the snake in it plainly visible. He had never beheld such an evil countenance. The man hated the king and delighted in doing him wrong. With the glass in his hand, he drew near the bed, set it down, and began his usual rude rousing of his majesty. Not at once succeeding, he took a lancet from his pocket, and was parting its cover, with an involuntary hiss of hate between his closed teeth, when Curdie stooped and whispered to Lena, "Take him by the leg, Lena." She darted noiselessly upon him. With a face of horrible consternation, he gave his leg one tug to free it. The next instant Curdie heard the one scrunch with which she crushed the bone like a stick of celery. He tumbled on the floor with a yell. "Drag him out, Lena," said Curdie. Lena took him by the collar and dragged him out. Her master followed to direct her, and they left him lying across the Lord Chamberlain's door, where he gave another horrible yell and fainted. The king had waked at the first cry, and by the time Curdie re-entered, he had got it at his sword, where it hung from the centre of the tester, that's the bed frame, had drawn it, and was trying to get out of bed. But when Curdie told him all was well, he lay down again as quietly as a child, comforted by his mother from a terrible, troubled dream. Curdie went to the door to watch. The doctor's yells had aroused many, but not one had yet ventured to appear. Bells were rung violently, but none were answered, and in a minute or two Curdie had what he was watching for. The door of the Lord Chamberlain's room opened, and pale, with hideous terror, his lordship peeped out. Seeing no one, he advanced to step into the corridor and tumbled over the doctor. Curdie ran up and held out his hand. He received in it the claw of a bird of prey, vulture or eagle. He could not tell which. So the Chamberlain had tripped, and Curdie ran up as if to help him and caught his hand and felt the hand inside the hand. His lordship, as soon as he was on his legs, taking him for one of the pages, abused him heartily for not coming sooner, and threatened him with dismissal from the king's service for cowardice and neglect. He began indeed what bade fair to be a sermon on the duties of a page, but catching sight of the man who lay at his door, and seeing it was the doctor, he fell out upon Curdie afresh for standing there doing nothing, and ordered him to fetch immediate assistance. Curdie left him, but slipped into the king's chamber, closed and locked the door, and left the rascals to look after each other. Ere long he heard hurrying footsteps, and for a few minutes there was a great muffled tumult of scuffling feet, low voices, and deep groanings. Then all was still again. Irene slept through the whole, so confidently did she rest, knowing Curdie was in her father's room, watching over him. And that's the end of that chapter. Time for a drink of water, and today a mouthful of coffee. So what's the weather like where you are? Is it cold or is it too hot? Are you having wild storms or lovely summery days? Or even one of those beautiful, clear, crisp winter days? Do you look out the window and think, ooh, I'm glad I'm not out there? Or do you look out the window and go, oh, I wish I was out there? We all live in so many different places. We shall continue. The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald, Chapter 24. The Prophecy. Curdie sat and watched every motion of the sleeping king. All the night, to his ear, the palace lay as quiet as a nursery of healthful children. Healthy. Children full of health. At sunrise he called the princess. How has His Majesty slept? Were her first words as she entered the room. Quite quietly, answered Curdie, that is, since the doctor was got rid of. How did you manage that? Inquired Irene. And Curdie had to tell all about it. How terrible, she said. Did it not startle the king dreadfully? It did rather. I found him getting out of bed, sword in hand. The brave old man, cried the princess. Not so old, said Curdie, as you will soon see. He went off again in a minute or so, but for a little while he was restless, and once when he lifted his hand it came down on the spikes of his crown, and he half waked. But where is the crown? Cried Irene in sudden terror. I stroked his hands, answered Curdie, and took the crown from them, and ever since he has slept quietly, and again smiled in his sleep. I have never seen him do that, said the princess. But what have you done with the crown, Curdie? Look, said Curdie, moving away from the bedside. Irene followed him, and there in the middle of the floor she saw a strange sight. Lena lay at full length, fast asleep, her tail stretched out straight behind her, and her forelegs before her. Between the two paws, meeting in front of her, her nose just touching it behind, glowed and flashed the crown, like a nest for the hummingbirds of heaven. Irene gazed and looked up with a smile. But what if the thief were to come? The thief were to come, and she not to wake, she said. Shall I try her? And as she spoke, she stooped toward the crown. No, 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 cried Curdie, terrified. She would frighten you out of your wits. I would do it to show you, but she would wake your father. You have no conception with what a roar she would spring at my throat, but you shall see how lightly she wakes the moment I speak to her. Lena, She was on her feet the same instant, with her great tail sticking out straight behind her, just as it had been lying. "Good dog," said the princess, and patted her head. Lena wagged her tail solemnly, like the boom of an anchored sloop. Irene took the crown and laid it where the king would see it when he woke. "Now, princess," said Curdie, "I must leave you for a few minutes. You must bolt the door, please, and not open it to anyone." Away to the cellar he went with Lena, taking care as they passed through the servants' hall to get her a good breakfast. In about 1 minute she had eaten what he gave her and looked up in his face. It was not more that she wanted, but work. So out of the cellar they went, through the passage, and Curdie into the dungeon, where he pulled up Lena, opened the door, led her out, and shut it again behind her. As he reached the door of the king's chamber, Lena was flying out of the gate of Winterstorm as fast as her mighty legs could carry her. So Curdie has let Lena out of the castle, going through the tunnel, and he's gone back to the king's chamber. "What's come of the wench?" growled the men servants one to another when the chambermaid appeared among them the next morning. There was something in her face which they could not understand and did not like. "Are we all dirt?" they said. "What are you thinking about? Have you seen yourself in the glass this morning, miss?" She made no answer. "Do you want to be treated as you deserve, or will you speak, you hussy?" said the first woman cook. "I would fain know what right you have to put on a face like that." "You won't believe me," said the girl. "Of course not. What is it?" "I must tell you whether you believe me or not," she said. "Of course you must." "It is this, then. If you do not repent of your bad ways, you are all going to be punished, all turned out of the palace together." "A mighty punishment," said the butler. "A good riddance, say I, of the trouble of keeping minxes like you in order. And why, pray, should we be turned out? What have I to repent of now, your holiness?" "That you know best yourself," said the girl. "A pretty piece of insolence! How should I know, forsooth, what a menial like you has got against me? There are people in this house, oh, I'm not blind to their ways, but every one for himself, say I. Pray, misjudgment, who gave you such an impertinent message to his Majesty's household?" "One who has come to set things right in the king's house." "Right, indeed," cried the butler, but that moment the thought came back to him of the roar he had heard in the cellar, and he turned pale and was silent. The steward took it up next. "And pray, pretty prophetess," he said, attempting to chuck her under the chin, "what have I got to repent of?" "That you know best yourself," said the girl. "You have but to look into your books or your heart." "Can you tell me, then, what I have to repent of?" said the groom of the chambers. "That you know best yourself," said the girl once more. "The person who told me to tell you said the servants of this house had to repent of thieving and lying and unkindness and drinking, and they will be made to repent of them one way, if they don't do it of themselves another." Then arose a great hubbub, for by this time all the servants in the house were gathered about her, and all talked together in towering indignation. "Thieving indeed," cried one. "A pretty word in a house where everything is left lying about in a shameless way, tempting poor innocent girls. A house where nobody cares for anything or has the least respect to the value of property." "I suppose you envy me this brooch of mine," said another. "That there was just a half sheet of note paper about it, not a scrap more, in a drawer that's always open, in the writing table, in the study. What sort of a place is that for a jewel? Can you call it stealing to take a thing from such a place as that? Nobody cared a straw about it. It might as well have been in the dust hole, if it had been locked up, then to be sure." "Drinking," said the chief porter with a husky laugh. "And who wouldn't drink when he had a chance? Or who would repent it, except that the drink was gone? Tell me that, Miss Innocence." "Lying," said a great coarse footman. "I suppose you mean when I told you yesterday you were a pretty girl when you didn't pout." "Lying indeed. Tell us something worth repenting of. Lying is the way of Winterstorm. You should have heard Jabez lying to the cook last night. He wanted a sweetbread for his pup and pretended it was for the princess. Ha!"
Unkindness. I wonder who's unkind, going and listening to any stranger against her fellow servants and then bringing back his wicked words of trouble to trouble them, said the oldest and worst of the housemaids. One of ourselves, too. Come, you hypocrite, this is all an invention of yours and your young man's, to take your revenge on us because we found you out in a lie last night. Tell true now, wasn't it the same that stole the loaf and the pie that sent you with the impudent message? As she said this, she stepped up to the housemaid and gave her, instead of time to answer, a box on the ear that almost threw her down, and whoever could get at her began to push and hustle and pinch and punch her. You invite your fate, she said quietly. They fell furiously upon her, drove her from the hall with kicks and blows, hustled her along the passage and threw her down the stair to the wine cellar, then locked the door at the top of it and went back to their breakfast. In the meantime, the king and the princess had had their bread and wine, and the princess, with Curdie's help, had made the room as tidy as she could. They were terribly neglected by the servants, and now Curdie set himself to interest and amuse the king and prevent him from thinking too much, in order that he might the sooner think better. Presently, at His Majesty's request, he began from the beginning and told everything he could recall of his life about his father and mother and their cottage on the mountain, of the inside of the mountain and the work there, about the goblins and his adventures with them. When he came to finding the princess and her nurse overtaken by the twilight on the mountain, Irene took up her share of the tale and told all about herself to that point, and then Curdie took it up again, and so they went on, each fitting in the part that the other did not know, thus keeping the hoop of the story running straight, and the king listened with wondering and delighted ears, astonished to find that he could so ill comprehend, yet fitting so well together from the lips of two narrators. At last, with the mission given him by the wonderful princess and his consequent adventures, Curdie brought up the whole tale to the present moment. Then a silence fell, and Irene and Curdie thought the king was asleep, but he was far from it. He was thinking about many things. After a long pause, he said, "Now at last, my children, I am compelled to believe many things I could not and do not yet understand. Things I used to hear and sometimes see as often as I visited my mother's home. Once, for instance, I heard my mother say to her father, speaking of me, 'He is a good, honest boy, but he will be an old man before he understands.' And my grandfather answered, 'Keep up your heart, child. My mother will look after him.' I thought often of their words, and the many strange things besides I both heard and saw in that house. But by degrees, thinking I could not understand them, I gave up thinking of them, and indeed I had almost forgotten them. When you, my child, talking that day about the Queen Irene and her pigeons, and what you had seen in her garret, brought them all back to my mind in a vague mass. But now they keep coming back to me one by one, every one for itself, and I shall just hold my peace and lie here quite still and think about them all till I get well again." What he meant they could not quite understand, but they saw plainly that already he was better. "Put away my crown," he said. "I am tired of seeing it, and have no more fears of its safety." They put it away together, withdrew from the bedside, and left him in peace. And that's the end of that chapter. And I shall read one more, but not just yet, because chapter break, drink of water and coffee. So if you've got any plans for tomorrow, my plans are all tied up with other people, so it will depend on what suits them. Because this is my plan for today, reading to you, and tomorrow, not reading to you. Probably go and explore a little bit more of Wellington. The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald. Chapter 25, The Avengers. not the Marvel Avengers. No, this is George MacDonald's Avengers in The Princess and Curdie. There was nothing now to be dreaded from Dr Kelman, but it made Curdie anxious as the evening drew near to think that not a soul belonging to the court had been to visit the king, or ask how he did that day. He feared in some shape or other a more determined assault. He had provided himself a place in the room to which he might retreat upon approach, and whence he could watch, but not once had he had to betake himself to it. Towards night the king fell asleep. Curdie thought more and more uneasily of the moment when he must again leave them for a little while. Deeper and deeper fell the shadows. No one came to light the lamp. The princess drew her chair close to Curdie. She would rather it were not so dark, she said. She was afraid of something. She could not tell what, nor could she give any reason for her fear, but that all was so dreadfully still. When it had been dark about an hour, Curdie thought Lena might be returned, and reflected that the sooner he went, the less danger of any assault while he was away. There was more risk of his own presence being discovered, no doubt, but things were now drawing to a crisis, and it must be run. So, telling the princess to lock all the doors of the bedchamber and let no one in, he took his mattock, and with here a run and there a halt under cover, gained the door to the head of the cellar and cellar stair in safety. To his surprise he found it locked, and the key was gone. There was no time for deliberation. He felt where the lock was, and dealt it a tremendous blow with his mattock. It needed but a second to dash the door open. Someone laid a hand on his arm. "Who is it?" said Curdie. "I told you they wouldn't believe me, sir," said the housemaid. "I have been here all day." He took her hand and said, "You are a good, brave girl. Now come with me, lest your enemies imprison you again." He took her to the cellar, locked the door, lighted the bit of candle, gave her a little wine, told her to wait there till he came, and went out the back way. Swiftly he swung himself up into the dungeon. Lena had done her part. The place was swarming with creatures, animal forms wilder and more grotesque than ever ramped in nightmare dream. So Lena has been off for the day, gathering up the creatures. Close by the hole, waiting his coming, her green eyes piercing the gulf below, Lena had but just laid herself down when he appeared. All about the vault and up the slope of the rubbish heap lay and stood and squatted the 49 whose friendship Lena had conquered in the wood. They all came crowding about Curdie. He must get them into the cellar as quickly as ever he could, but when he looked at the size of some of them, he feared it would be a long business to enlarge the hole sufficiently to let them through. At it he rushed, hitting vigorously at its edge with his mattock. At the very first blow came a splash from the water beneath, but ere he could heave a third, a creature like a tapir, only that the grasping point of his proboscis, that's its long nose, was hard as the steel of Curdie's hammer, pushed him gently aside, making room for another creature with a head like a great club, which it began banging upon the floor with terrible force and noise. After about a minute of this battery, the tapir came up again, shoved Clubhead aside, and putting its own head into the hole began gnawing at the sides of it with the finger of its nose, in such a fashion that the fragments fell into a continuous gravelly shower into the water. So this is another creature that crushes the rocks with its mouth. In a few minutes the opening was large enough for the biggest creature amongst them to go through it. Next came the difficulty of letting them down. Some were quite light, but the half of them were too heavy for the rope, not to say for his arms. The creatures themselves seemed to be puzzling where or how they were to go. One after another of them came back, looked down through the hole, and drew back. Curdie thought if he let Lena down, perhaps that would suggest something. Possibly they did not see the opening on the other side. He did so, and Lena stood, lighting up the entrance of the passage with her gleaming eyes. One by one the creatures looked down again, and one by one they drew back, each standing aside to glance at the next, as if to say, "Now you have a look." At last it came the turn of the serpent, with the long body, the 4 short legs behind, and the little wings before. No sooner had he poked his head through than he poked it further through, and further yet, until there was little more than his legs left in the dungeon. By that time he had got his head and neck well into the passage beside Lena. Then his legs gave a great waddle and spring, and he tumbled himself far as there was betwixt them, heels over head, into the passage. "That's all very well for you, Mr. Leg Serpent," thought Curdie to himself, "but what is to be done with the rest?" He had hardly time to think it, however, before the creature's head appeared again through the floor. He caught hold of the bar of iron to which Curdie's rope was tied, and settling it securely across the narrowest part of the irregular opening, held it fast with his teeth. It was plain to Curdie from the universal hardness amongst them that they must all at one time or another have been creatures of the mines. He saw at once what this one was after. He had planted his feet firmly upon the floor of the passage where Lena was, and stretched his long body up and across the chasm to serve as a bridge for the rest. He mounted instantly upon his neck, threw his arms around him as far as they would go, and slid down in ease and safety, the bridge just bending a little as his weight glided over it. But he thought some of the creatures would try his teeth. One by one the oddities followed, and slid down in safety. When they seemed to be all landed, he counted them. There were but 48. Up the rope he went, and found one which had been afraid to trust himself to the bridge, and no wonder, for he had neither legs nor head, nor arms nor tail. He was just a round thing, about a foot in diameter, with a nose and mouth and eyes on one side of the ball. He had made his journey by rolling as swiftly as the fleetest of them could run. The back of the leg serpent not being flat, he could not quite trust himself to roll straight and not drop into the gulf. Curdie took him in his arms, and the moment he looked down through the hole, the bridge made itself again, and he slid into the passage in safety, with ball body to his chest. He ran first to the cellar to warn the girl not to be frightened at the avengers of wickedness. Then he called to Lena to bring in her friends. One after another they came trooping in, till the cellar seemed full of them. The housemaid regarded them without fear. "Sir," she said, "there is one of the pages I don't take for a bad fellow." "Then keep him near you," said Curdie. "And now can you show me a way to the king's chamber, not through the servants' hall?" "There is a way through the chamber of the colonel of the guard," she answered, "but he is ill and in bed." "Take me that way," said Curdie. By many ups and downs and windings and turnings she brought him to a dimly lighted room where lay an elderly man asleep. His arm was outside the coverlid, and Curdie gave his hand a hurried grasp as he went by. His heart beat for joy, for he had found a good, honest, human hand. "I suppose that is why he is ill," he said to himself. It was now close upon supper time, and when the girl stopped at the door of the king's chamber, he told her to go and give the servants one warning more. "Say the messenger sent you. I will be with you very soon," he said. The king was still asleep. Curdie talked to the princess for a few minutes, told her not to be frightened, whatever noises she heard, only to keep her door locked till he came, and then he left her. And that's the end of the chapter and the end of today's reading. So we'll see you again next time, which will hopefully be on Wednesday, New Zealand time, day of the week. New Zealand, 3 o'clock, Wednesday. Whatever time that is for you, you can look that up online. There is lots of places online you can find that out for yourself. So I'll leave you to do that. If you're new here and would like to get into conversation with me and some of our friends, you can join us through our Discord server. There's a link down below in my About section. You can also, somewhere down there, go follow the link to my YouTube channel, where you can listen to other stories that we've had in the past, like Millie Molly Mandy, The Wind in the Willows, The Secret Garden, A Little Princess, and even the book that comes before this one, which is called The Princess and the Goblin, which is where we first meet the princess and Curdie when Curdie is still a miner over in the mountains. So please feel free to join us, and also click the follow button, or if you're watching this on YouTube, then click the subscribe button, because then you'll be told when we have a new video happening. If it's on Twitch, you'll be told when I'm live. Okay, bye. Have a great week.